Well, I don't have a pen and paper with me because, as usual, I'm sitting waiting for children to come out of something. So should we do this? In one breath. No, not in one breath, in one take. We'll do it in one take. Okay, so the year is 1066, and Edward the Confessor, he's had a few strokes and he drops down dead. And the throne goes to Harold Godwinson. And William of Normandy, he's not very happy about that. So he comes over and he fights with Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Harold may or may not have had an arrow in the eye, but it didn't really matter because he was dead. And the throne went to William, who became William I. 21 years later, he's killed, perforates a bowel or something, and he hands the throne then to his son, who's also called William. So he becomes William II, William Rufus, because he had a red complexion. Now William Rufus was out hunting in the New Forest one day in 1100, and he gets an arrow in the chest and he drops down dead. Now it may or may not have been murder orchestrated by his brother Henry. It doesn't really matter because he was dead, and Henry becomes the next king, and he's Henry I. Henry I is in France, and he has too many lampreys, a surfeit if you will, and he drops down dead. But the throne goes to his... Oh, it all gets really messy, because he had said that his only surviving legitimate child, Matilda, could be queen, but she was a girl, and cousin Stephen wasn't very happy about that because he was a boy. So they fought like mad. This horrible time called the Anarchy. Stephen, it all kind of went horribly wrong when his son died, and he said that Matilda's son Henry could become the next monarch when Stephen died, and that's what happened, and he became Henry II. Now Henry II had a few children with Eleanor of Aquitaine. The first one to get the crown was Richard. Richard the Lionheart became Richard I. He couldn't speak English. He was always over in France or crusading or something. In 1199, he got a crossbow bolt in the shoulder and he went gangrenous and he dropped down dead. Now, he had wanted his nephew Arthur to become king, but Arthur was a young man, and Richard's brother John didn't like that very much, so he maybe killed Arthur and he became king, King John. Now King John died of dysentery, but it was okay because he had a son and he was called Henry, and he became Henry III. Now Henry III had a thing for Edward the Confessor, Saint Edward, so he called his son Edward. And when he became king, he was Edward I. And the reason for that is because the numbers started at 1066 at the beginning of this story. So any Edwards before then just had names. He had a number. He was Edward I. But you might also know him as Longshanks because he was really tall. And he was on his way to Scotland to have words with Robert the Bruce when he felt ill and he dropped down dead. But it was okay because he had a son, and he became Edward II. Now, Edward II was a bit useless and he was deposed, and he may or may not have had a red-hot poker up his rear end. But it doesn't really matter because he dropped down dead, and he had a son who became Edward III. And you're about to tell me that you're related to Edward III. Well done. The thing is, we all are. Anyway, Edward III lasted quite a long time, and he had a son called, guess what? Edward. He was Edward of Woodstock, Edward the Black Prince. Now, he didn't make it. He died of dysentery before he could become king. But it was okay because he had a son and he was called Richard, and he became Richard II. Now, Richard II was a bit rubbish at ruling, and he also upset his cousin, who was also a grandson of Edward III. He was called Henry Bolingbroke. He upset him enough that they fought, and Henry won. And Henry became Henry IV. Now, Henry IV had a son, and he was Henry V, the warrior king, the one that won at Agincourt against the French. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, even though that was about half a bit, that doesn't matter. Anyway, Henry V had a son, and he was called Henry, and he became Henry VI. So Henry VI, nice chap, had a few problems, wasn't very good at being king, and he he fought with another cousin. So this was the time of the Wars of the Roses. It went back and forth, and this other cousin, Edward, he won the day, and he became Edward IV. Edward IV got quite poorly, and one day he got pneumonia and he dropped down dead. But it was okay because he had it wasn't okay because he had a son and he was young. He was Edward V. But he had a regent. He had Uncle Richard looking after him. But in 1483, Edward V and his younger brother Richard disappeared, and shame for Richard, he had to become Richard III. He had to become king. So he became Richard III. He was the Yorkist king. The Yorks were doing okay, and the Lancastrians were, well, they still had an iron in the fire because they had this young lad, Henry Tudor. And Henry Tudor came over and he landed in Wales and he got to Bosworth and met Richard III in battle, and Henry won. Richard III was killed, and Henry became Henry VII, the first of the Tudor kings. Now, Henry VII had a few kids. The first one, Arthur, who should have been king, dropped down dead. So the throne went to his brother Henry, who became Henry VIII. Now, there were some other ones here. Margaret's sister went north to Scotland and married James IV of Scotland, and that line becomes important later. And Mary went to France and she married the King of France, but that didn't work out. So she married a chap called Charles Brandon, and that'll become important later. Anyway, Henry VIII, he tries to have a boy. At first he has Mary and then Elizabeth, and then along comes Edward. Hurrah, a baby boy is born. And he becomes the next king because he wasn't the oldest, but he was the boy. So he becomes king, but he's really ill. He has tuberculosis. He doesn't last very long. And the throne goes, well, it gets complicated. The nearest that some people thought should get it was Lady Jane Grey. Now, Lady Jane Grey didn't last more than a week because Mary chopped her head off and became Mary the First, Queen Regnant. Mary won. Now, Mary tried to have children of her own but didn't succeed, and so the throne, when she died, went to her sister Elizabeth, and she was Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth the same tried, well, no, she didn't, but she didn't have any children, and the throne, where was it going to go? It couldn't go over the sort of Lady Jane Grey direction because she was headless, and Elizabeth had chopped off Mary Stuart's head. Now, she had, do you remember I said Margaret went north and married James IV of Scotland, and then they had a child, and that was James V, and then he had a child, and that was Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Elizabeth had chopped her head off, but it was okay because she had a son, a Protestant son, and he was James VI of Scotland. Now, James VI of Scotland rode down to London on his pony and became James I of England as well. So we've got James, who is the 6th of Scotland and the 1st of England, ruling both countries. Right, now, he had a few children. The first one died before he could become king, and the throne went to his brother Charles. Now, Charles, he fought with Parliament and over power, and he fought with the church over religion, and it all went wrong, and he ended up losing his head. And for a while there wasn't a monarchy. There was an interregnum. There was a chap called Oliver Cromwell who was rocking Parliament for nearly a decade. And when he died, well, it was kind of passed on to his son, but he was a bit useless, so the monarchy were asked to come back. Remember Charles that had his head chopped off? Well, it was okay because he had a son and he became Charles II. Now, Charles II didn't have any legitimate children of his own to pass the throne to, so when he died, the throne went to his brother James. Now, James was useless. He was also Catholic as well, which ruffled a few feathers. Now, you might say he left, you might say he was chased out, but he was gone, and he took his young Catholic son with him. And left was Mary, his eldest daughter. Now, Mary was married to a cousin called William, so he had a kind of claim to the throne as well, William of Orange. So they ruled together as William and Mary. Now, she died first of a hemorrhagic smallpox, and he remained king until his horse tripped over a molehill and he broke his collarbone and got pneumonia and died. So they didn't have any children. Where was the throne going to go? Well, Mary had a younger sister called Anne. Now, Anne became queen. Now, this is the Anne that had 17 pregnancies. She tried really hard to keep it all going, but she didn't have a child of her own when she died. So where was it going to go? Well, the James Stuarts weren't going to get it because they were Catholics, and that was all a bit of a mess. So we go back to James VI of Scotland and James I of England. He had another child, and a daughter, and she had a daughter. Now, she had Sophia. She died a few months before Anne, so she didn't get to be queen, but she had a son, and he was called George, and he became George I, came over from Hanover, hardly spoke English, didn't matter, he was the king. Anyway, he had a son, and he was called George II, and George II had a son, and he was called Fred. Fred didn't make it either, but it was okay because he had a son, and he was George III, who came to the throne really young, so he was there a while until he went mad, and George IV was regent for a while, and then he became king. Now, George IV had a daughter, but she died in childbirth, and so did the boy, and so the throne went to her uncle. The throne went to George's brother, William. He became William IV. He was in his 60s. He wasn't that fussed about doing the job, but he did it. He kept the throne warm for his niece. He had a brother called Edward, but Edward had died, but he had a niece called Alexandrina, and the throne went to her not long after she turned 18, and she changed her name to Victoria. She was Queen Victoria, and she ruled for ages. And when she died, her son became king. He became king as Edward VII. He had a son called George V. He had a son called Edward VIII. He didn't last the year. He abdicated, and the throne went to his brother, George VI. And George VI had a couple of kids, Elizabeth and Margaret. Elizabeth became the next queen. She was Elizabeth II, and she ruled for ages until she died last year. And her son, Charles III, at the age of, 73, became the king. Bloody hell. Well, I'm sure everyone in the comments will tell me that I've missed someone because, 10 minutes of speaking wasn't enough.